As we've discussed before, everything follows rules, and then the law is explained within the restrictions of those rules. Part of the point of history is that everything has led to this moment, and the same holds true for fantasy history. Everything that has happened in the past has been written to explain what we do in the present, from power limitations to the Vancian system to the available monsters that we can fight. And sometimes history can be rewritten, changes made to explain a major event, because the thing about fantasy history is that you can always retroactively insert it to explain things that have already happened, because technically none of it has happened. Sufficiently confused? Excellent. I mean, no, not excellent, because this is an education video, but confused people usually wait around longer to... You know what? Let's move on. If you swing a sword, it's not too great of a stretch to assume that as we move from edition to edition, people are learning how to swing a sword better, or with less effort, or more destructively. Tradition and progression are a strange balance in D&D, but the spirit of sneak attack tends to stay the same between editions. It's just the dice rules that are manifestly different. Similarly, there can be story ideas and lore changes to explain where the Guild of Assassins went, and why suddenly there are all these rogues everywhere, and they can be generally accepted, because what's happening is fundamental to a society or people, but not fundamental to the fabric of the world. Magic is fundamental to the world of Faerun, and can't have a separate system of magic to other D&D worlds when there's an edition change. It's not a societal change, because it doesn't matter what the society believes about the nature of magic, because it's all tied to the weave. The weave, as we've explained in my first video, is the rule set by which magic can be learned, manifested, held in lasting patterns. In other worlds it's called a Karsa, or, well, it's called magic, but the underlying idea is a Karsa, and it's a natural rule, as easily explained and kept as gravity or photosynthesis. In Faerun, the weave is defined and controlled by the goddess of magic, aka Mistral, aka Mistra, aka Midnight, aka Mistra. She writes the rules for the flow of magic, she dictates the edicts of who can learn magic, and she has changed those rules in the past. Mistra is the mechanism by which magic changes between editions, and you can see that because bad things always happen to Mistra just as a new edition comes out. She's essentially what happened to Optimus Prime in the movies, so that kids would be okay with buying Rodimus Prime toys. From 1st to 2nd edition, Mistra is killed, and a mortal woman gains her essence and ascends to the new goddess of magic. Gods gain their powers from the strength and multitudes of their worshippers, rather than being powerful beings in their own right to whom followers are just playthings. Players are given greater agency as their actions and beliefs are given a bigger importance. Mistra's transition to Avatar and disconnection of the weave, not to mention death, caused a fundamental change to the Vancian rules and power of spells. Indeed, some spells were foreshadowed to have completely different effects in the stories, just so you would be mentally prepared when your signature spell didn't work in the same way when you bought the AD&D rulebooks. From 3rd to 4th edition we have the Spell Plague, where Mistra is killed and magical rule and logic collapsed. Remember, a caster is the natural energy and manifesting source of magic, and the weave is just the rules by which a caster can be tapped into. A caster ran amok, and even worse, it was tainted with the madness of Mistra's assassin, so the only rule was manifest insanity. As the madness spread throughout the material plane at the speed of plot, and leached into the other planes through the natural portals of the age, magic and spells and items became corrupted, infected. The portals are also the nexus between two planes, and the madness made the jump to barrier magic, merging some planes together, pulling the Feywild closer to the material plane. But most notably the weave was gone, and though the effects of wild magic calmed, arcane spellcasters had to discover new rules of magic that closely resembled the methods of divine and primal spellcasters to avoid the lingering spell plague effects. Spells officially became methodologies of manipulation that could be cast at will, or with a measure of rest, or once per day. From 4th to 5th edition, we saw something good happen to Mistra, in that she resurrected herself and brought the weave back with many of the same rules that preceded the Spell Plague, in a triumphant interpretation of the "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" rule. However, some of the new lessons made its way into the new Weave rule set, including the at-will casting of cantrips. Perhaps Mystra wanted to make sure that wizards would be happy to see her again, in the sort of, oh hey, I know you did just fine without me, but I'll let you keep the unlimited spell thing you got going on, and I'll let you roll 8d6 per fireball cast, because I know how much you missed that. It also sought to explain the player-centric outlook of D&D Beyond, with deities becoming quieter and more distant from the material plane, meaning that mortals had to be the solvers of issues in the world, instead of deities just sending avatars out to deal with anything difficult. Did we forget the transition to 3rd edition? Possibly, but there was no cataclysmic event that I could find in the history of Forgotten Realms to make the change between these two rule sets. Perhaps if anyone knows of a Faerun specific event, they can tell me in the comments below and I'll create an addendum to this video. I do know that a lot of people credit the adventure series, the Vecna, as the precursor to 3rd edition, as it changes the cosmology of D&D at the end, but there's no event specific to the realms. Perhaps that's a reflection of the IRL times though. This is entirely just opinion based on incomplete knowledge. Always a welcome part of any educational video, but maybe narrative transitions were less important to people at this time, what with the and then media we had and our acceptance of things happening without needing to understand how they got there. I'd be interested in hearing debate about that. Comments below. But there is a retroactive transition that I wanted to talk about today in more depth. It was an age of wonders where the goddess of magic, Mistral, allowed mortals to experience the full wonder and majesty of magic, where the various peoples of the world could learn magic with a greater ease than now, where spells higher than 9th level were possible and the truly gifted and powerful mages were able to complete truly astonishing feats of magic, culminating in events that I believe were equal parts his fault and her fault. Being the embodiment and consciousness of the Weave, Mistral could wield magic like no other being. She had no practical limitations to how many spells she could cast, how powerful they were, how often she could cast them, or what form they could take. Unless she willed otherwise, she was immune to all spells except those that bypassed her control of the Weave and drew on the raw magic from which the Weave was woven. She could withhold magic from any entity, make spellcasting impossible, and even prevent them from using magical items if she so desired. She could also block other deities from accessing the Weave, but she could not prevent them from granting spells to their priests through prayer. She could be coldly serious one moment and laughingly boisterous the next. She could be blushingly innocent or sagely wise, blithely unfocused or relentlessly dedicated. But in all her capriciousness, she tried to do what she thought best for the Weave and practice of the art and Toril. If she had flaws, it was at times that she seemed naive and too trusting. Which really came up with the introduction of our next celebrity, Karsus, the definitely not arrogant, not in any way. Karsus was born about 3,100 years after the nation's founding in -696 DR. Gifted with magic, but lacking the necessary discipline that comes with hard work and research, he was able to cast his first spell at the age of 2, and by the age of 22 had become the youngest arcanist to ever create his own floating city. He founded a school of magic on his enclave and encouraged the attendance of radical thinkers and those interested in taboo projects. Karsus's netherall civilization was being attacked by the Faerun, which you can learn in so much more detail if you go over to AJ's channel, because I'm sticking with they were fantasy triffids. But the war with the Netherese had begun to severely deplete the resources of the Netherall Empire, and also begun to damage the Weave of Magic itself. In desperation, Karsus decided that he should shoulder the responsibility of his entire people, and designed a spell called Karsus's Avatar. This spell was the first, and spoilers, last, 12th level spell ever designed. Much of the information about it was lost by deliberate design, but here's what we do know. It required 6 hours to weave the exact manipulation of a caster for the spell to manifest, and counted as a spell of 4 distinct schools of magic: enchantment, evocation, transmutation, and arcane psionics. Due to the complexities of the manipulation, not to mention the fact that the spell required a braid of school patterns, the material components were apparently pretty crazy to help turn intent into manifestation. The fact that they were so intensely rare is probably the only reason why we know at all that it required mixing a stone-filled gizzard of a gold dragon into a mixture of Tarrasque blood and 12-headed Hydra bile to just enchant one of the material components of the spell. When Karsus completed the spell, it was at that moment he knew he screwed up. You see, Karsus had grown up a magical prodigy, as close to being a sorcerer as the rules of that age probably allowed. The Weave advised the Sentients how easy it was to grasp magic, and ultra-powerful spells were made possible through only time. Yes, he was likely intensely intelligent, but arrogant. He truly believed that if he were the god of magic, he'd be able to wipe out the Faerun in record time and save his entire civilization. Essentially, it was like acing Microsoft Flight Simulator, and then, when on a plane, walking up to the cockpit, knocking out the pilot because you think you could get the plane there faster. And speaking of inevitably crashing, when the spell was completed, the full portfolio of magic control came his, and the power of Mistral was very quickly siphoned to him. Instantly, Karsus realized that the power and ability was his, but he retained his mortal consciousness. Suddenly he saw the weave of the planet, the ebb and flow of 1,000 webs of power, some that contradicted others and still more that threatened to overload the system with vast reservoirs of power that constantly had to be kept in check. He couldn't control that. He couldn't in a million years, because part of what makes a deity is their superior consciousness. With the weave threatening to explode and destroy most of the world, Mistral used the last of her power to remove herself from the weave. As she was the source by which Karsus was gaining control, Karsus' spell instantly failed, and the sudden power deficit turned Karsus instantly to stone. The connection to magic became inert across the world, and the last thing that Karsus saw was the near-total destruction of his entire civilization, as the flying cities rained down upon those in a much more successful enactment of Ultron's master plan. When Mistral came back, reincarnated seconds after her self-sacrifice, she renamed herself Mistra and reactivated the weave, and saved a few of the flying cities. She also rewrote the rules of magic, allowing the manipulation of a caster to not allow spells above 10th level, and for individual mages to only be able to access magic through intense and exhaustive study. Likely, she also made the barrier between intent and manipulation much harder, which was the primary reason it was so easy to manifest magic. And as a final flip to Karsus, Mistra warned all mages and priests in dreams about Karsus and his folly, to ensure that such a thing never happened again. Which it wouldn't, because spells of that level couldn't work anymore by any means, but there were probably other ways to complete the same thing. But this is the canon reason why we are now limited to 9th level spells on Faerun, and Epic Magic can create 10th level spells, but usually no higher. Also, can we talk about Mistral's decision to let this happen? Remember her flaw? Too trusting. There is no limit to the types of spells she can cast, of whichever level she wants, and whatever effect. As a controller of the weave, she should have known that such a spell existed, and possibly could have detected the casting of the spell before it was completed, or even stopped it because it was targeting her, not the weave. She could have stopped it as it was being cast, or prevented the possibility of the spell ever being invented in the first place, or even have kept a spell going that negated any such effect that was directed at her, but she didn't, probably because she didn't believe anyone was stupid, arrogant, or desperate enough to try, and that just goes to show that she didn't understand mortals, and I firmly believe that she was just as much to blame as Karsus. Coming up next time, we're going to discuss the ways to get around Mistra's ban, and move ever closer to the point of this video series, Mythals.